thanks to everybody for coming. My name is Chris Paxson. I am the president of Brown University, but actually tonight I'm speaking in a very different capacity, which is I also happen to be chair of the executive committee of the Board of Governors of the JCB. And one of the great pleasures of being here for the past year and a half has been getting to know this wonderful library, working on the recruitment of a wonderful new director, Neil Safier. We're very glad he's here. And now I have the pleasure of welcoming you to a very special 250th anniversary event. Tonight, the JCB is partnering with the Department of History to provide a historical background to Brown's founding in a global context. This is a series of 7 lectures, and it will bring leading academic voices to campus to speak about the world at the moment of Brown's founding, focusing on a number of thematic areas, including early modern globalization, the slave trade, education, natives and empires, religion, health and medicine, and politics and governance. The series represents a collaboration of the library with other departments and centers at Brown, including the Department of Religious Studies, the Department of Education, the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, the School of Public Health, the Haffenreffer Museum of Anthropology, and the Watson Institute for International Studies. And I think this collection of centers and institutes that are partnering with the JCB speak to the breadth and diversity of the collections here and also of the interests of the fellows and faculty who are associated with the library. Each of the lectures will have an accompanying mini exhibition of related materials from the JCB. And this evening in particular, I think it's a great idea. It serves as the opening for a major exhibition dedicated to the 250th anniversary, and it's called Off to College, Higher Education in the Americas, 1551 to 1834. And this is an exhibition that runs through October 2014. I think this is particularly relevant because the big tent on the green is welcoming admitted students to Brown this year. And it's interesting to contrast their experience with the experience of much earlier college students. The exhibition includes JCB material that chart the founding and development of the earliest universities in the Americas. Lima was first in 1551, not to mention utopian and unrealized proposals and transatlantic debates on curriculum and standards. Among the documents is a manuscript copy of The Laws of the College in Providence in the State of Rhode Island, enacted by the fellowship and approved by the trustees of said college on July 30th, 1783. And there's a rule in here that I love. I'm thinking of reviving it. Rule 3 of Brown's College Rules stated, quote, "No student shall be admitted to this college until he shall have written out a correct copy of the laws of the college, or have otherwise obtained them and had them signed by the president and one or more of the tutors as the evidence of his admission, which copy he shall keep by him during his residence in college." Showing, I think, the extent to which the laws of the college were and are still taken very seriously. The copy shown in the exhibition is in the hand of Nicholas Brown, Jr., the son and nephew of 3 of the College of Rhode Island's founders and its future benefactor. It was in recognition of his gifts that the college changed its name to Brown University in 1804. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing this evening's lecture by longtime and very good friend of the JCB, Professor Joyce Chaplin of Harvard University. And now I want to turn things over to Neil Safier, Director and Librarian of the JCB. So welcome. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Chris, for offering us such a warm welcome to our friends and guests. You deserve that glass, among others. This evening is really an extraordinary opportunity for the library to participate in celebrating Brown's 250th anniversary. Although most of the books of this collection were acquired after 1764, and indeed the library dates its own founding to 1846. At the time there was a very large purchase of Americana. There are several volumes in the collection that came into the possession of the Brown family before the official founding of the university. And we actually have two of those texts on display right over there. One is the Secretary's Guide or Young Man's Companion in 4 parts, published in 1728, which has a signature on it of Nicholas Brown. The other is The Importance of the British Plantations in America, published in London in 1731, also with the signature of Nicholas Brown, from 1749. So the subtext, if you haven't figured out, is the JCB in some ways existed before Brown University did, but we're very pleased to be participating vigorously in this event. As I was preparing to arrive at the JCB in what now seems like a very long time ago, which was the summer of 2013, I was very keenly aware that my first year as director of the library would coincide with the 250th anniversary of Brown's founding. Aside from being very excited at the prospect of returning to my own alma mater in a sesquicentennial year, or semi-quincentenary, which is an equally unattractive term, I think. And for that reason, it may be that I had never heard it until this moment. But I was very insistent that the JCB do something to connect its own resources to this campus-wide celebration, ideally placing the founding of the university in a much broader context, as only the JCB's collection dedicated to the history of the Americas writ large could do. Like many of the ideas that I had before starting as director of the JCB, I found that they had in fact already been implemented prior to my arrival. Margot Nishimura, the library's deputy director, and my history department colleague, Linford Fisher, had already submitted a proposal to Brown's 250th committee for the library to spearhead a series of lectures in conjunction with the history department and the other centers and institutes that Chris discussed, reflecting on the global context of 1764 in a wide array of fields that were germane to Brown's founding. They had already garnered support from many campus constituencies and indeed had already thought about a date, April 22nd, for the inaugural lecture to take place. So this is very easy for me to step into. In honor of this event, however, we also decided to put together the exhibition that I hope you'll have an opportunity to see once the chairs are taken away, on education in the Americas, which has been guest curated by another history department colleague, Jeremy Mumford, who unfortunately can't be with us tonight. But it was also an idea that was suggested very early on by our deputy provost, Joe Mizell, who's here tonight as well, and may not speak on Jeremy's behalf, but certainly will have his own bit to add on the exhibition. Because of so much planning that went into this series, and long before I arrived, I wanted to give an opportunity for Linford Fisher to talk about the series briefly and to give you a sense of some of the coming attractions, which I hope you will attend in the same wonderful turnout as this event as well. And then I'll introduce also briefly our evening speaker. So Lynn.
Well, good evening to all of you. Thanks so much for being here on such a nice evening. When it's nice outside, it's hard to be inside. I want to thank a lot of different people here, and I'll try to keep this brief. I know we're testing your patience here on the pre remarks. First of all, thanks to Neil and to the John Carter Brown Library for such an enthusiastic partnership, even after arriving, as Neil laid out. Also to Cynthia and the History Department, too, for its support. the Brown 250th Office for its generous funding, which was important, to President Paxson for her remarks, and of course to Joyce Chaplin for being here this evening. Thanks to Margot Nishimura, who really is kind of the reason why we are doing a year-long series instead of a one-day event. Well, it was actually a year ago now, I first floated the idea to her of doing a one-day symposium that would sort of muck around in 1764 and think about this founding moment. And right away she suggested that it was worthy of a year-long conversation, not just a one-day symposium. And I think in the end, this was probably the right thing. So from the beginning, our idea was to focus on the actual year of Brown's founding, to think about the year 1764, and to think about it from different perspectives, on different themes, and also to place it in this wider global context. Like good historians, we wanted to know more about what was happening in the world in 1764, and how our knowledge of that wider context might actually help us understand better Brown in this founding moment. So that is sort of the rationale behind this whole series. It was difficult to think about which themes to include. As you can imagine, there's a number of very good candidates for inclusion. In the end, we chose the 7 that President Paxson laid out: globalization, slave trade, education, natives and empires, religion, health and medicine, and politics and governance. And after tonight's lecture on globalization, the next 6 lectures will take place during the academic year 2014-2015, culminating during commencement in 2015 with our own Gordon Wood. And I do hope you'll join us for these lectures in the coming year. These particular themes also made sense because they allowed us to partner with other units and departments on campus, which is very important for us in this planning process. And I won't list them all out, but it was exciting to think about having conversations with the School of Public Health, for example, or with the Hafenreffer or Department of Education, places and spaces we don't often get into, at least I don't as a historian. So we're hoping, in a way, that these kinds of collaborations, these kinds of bringing together of different constituencies on campus, will open up different kinds of conversations over the course of this next year to think not just about Brown, but also our intellectual community here on campus. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Lynn. Now that you have heard more or less the global context to this evening's lecture, I'm very happy, and it's my privilege to present this evening's speaker. Joyce Chaplin is James Duncan Phillips Professor of Early American History at Harvard University, having been a member of the Harvard History Department since 1998, which was the year that I met her, in fact. Coincidentally, this was also the year that she held the Charles H. Watts Memorial Fellowship at the JCB, a fellowship that I coincidentally also held several years later. Since that time, no one has been a better friend to this library. She has served on fellowship selection committees, given our annual Galletti Lecture, and most recently served on the committee to select our present director, for which I am personally very much in her debt. But I came to know and admire Joyce's impressive intellect and incisive wit long before then. We had a penchant for meeting at seminars and conferences of the Huntington Library, for instance. And knowing that she was a prolific scholar, I also was quite aware that she was a very ambitious one as well, always tackling topics that exceed the bounds of the traditional historian scope. She's written books that are both path-breaking and readable, which at times is a rare combination in our field. She is both a historian of culture and a historian of science, largely speaking in the Anglo-American world, having penned award-winning books on early agricultural technology, environmental theory, and early American intellectual history, including a wonderful book on Benjamin Franklin called The First Scientific American. Most recently, she's the author of Round About the World, A History of Circumnavigation, another topic dear, of course, to the JCB's collective heart, and is currently working on a history related to the environmental thought of Thomas Malthus, whose books, she has pointed out, are not in the collection of the JCB and should be. So it appears, in addition to everything else that she has contributed to the JCB, she is contributing indirectly to forging its acquisitions policy. And it is a charge we will take up with vigor. And it is on behalf of the History Department and my colleague, the chair of the History Department, Cynthia Brokaw, and the staff and the associates of the John Carter Brown Library that I ask you to join me in welcoming Joyce Chaplin to inaugurate this very special celebration of Brown's 250th anniversary.
Well, thank you, Christina, Neil, Lynn, Margot, and Cynthia. It's always just a great pleasure to be at the JCB. It's a privilege to be able to speak here, and it's just a real honor to be involved in this series of events for this important anniversary year, so thank you. Maybe you think that you know the source of my lectures titled "The World Is Not Enough." But long before Ian Fleming memorably attached that sentiment to James Bond, hero or anti-hero, depending on your taste, the phrase was the motto of the King of Spain. Philip II used the motto to advertise his global ambitions, his desire to have an empire that commanded the world. A medal struck probably in 1583 proclaimed him to be the King of Spain and Portugal and to be the ruler over an empire in the Americas. On the reverse of the medal appear the Latin words, I hope, non sufficit orbis, the world is not enough. It's an expression of insatiable ambition and desire, more and more, to a ridiculous extent. The phrase was supposed to have been first uttered by Alexander the Great, and Philip II's adoption of it expressed a sense that in modern times, Spain would not only recreate the imperial glory of the ancient empires of the Greeks and Romans, but outdo those empires by taking on territories that the ancients had never known about, specifically the Americas, the new worlds whose history is represented here at the John Carter Brown Library. The orbis over which Philip's eponymous horse gives a mighty leap is a literal globe. That object itself represents how Europeans' sense of geography had expanded well beyond that of their ancient ancestors, when the old Mediterranean world had been regarded as the center of European geography. The Mediterranean lay at the center of the ecumene, the Greek term for the inhabitable world, by which was meant merely, at this point, Europe, Asia, and Africa. By the 1580s, of course, the definition of the inhabitable world had been vastly enlarged beyond this bottom band that the ancients considered to be the only part where humans could live. By the 1580s, this definition of the inhabitable world had been vastly enlarged to include parts of the globe that had not originally been thought to have land, let alone people, but which turned out to have well-inhabited continents, most strikingly those of the Americas. Together, the old worlds of Europe, Africa, and Asia, and the new worlds of the Americas offered the possibility of a continuous global empire, one that did not just run across the ecumene of Alexander the Great, but also around a globe or orbis. And Spain, in its heyday of empire building during the 16th century especially, proceeded to acquire a global empire that indeed stretched from Europe to the Philippines and then through the Americas, crossing every major ocean. The world is not enough. Brown University's motto is far more decorous and pious. It is in Deo Speramus, or in God we hope, quite different. On the current seal of the university, the words accompany an image not of the earth, but of the sun. Each of the two mottos and the two colossal bodies of matter that are respectively referenced in each match each other quite nicely. On the brown seal, God is the ultimate extra-earthly power, somewhat symbolized by the sun. on Philip II's medal, a mortal, he, Philip, can only express his ambitions in terms of the earth itself, which may not be enough, but is all there's going to be. Even so, Brown's founders, not unlike the King of Spain, had some distinct and bold global goals for their university, founded 250 years ago this year, which is why we're gathered here today, and thank you very much for coming. If we're going to be strictly accurate, I'm speaking to you now in order to help commemorate the founding in 1764 of the College or University of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations in New England in America. The surviving copies of the university's original charter, one of which is in the case that direction, the original charter declared the birth of the institution on the last Monday of February in that year, 1764, which happened to be a leap year, by the way. Therefore, the founding day was February 27th, though it seems that the charter did not come into effect immediately, so we haven't actually missed the only important moment. The College of Rhode Island continued to exist under that name for 40 years until Nicholas Brown's significant financial bequest to the college inspired its renaming in 1804 to Brown University. The original name had a geographic function, I want to point out. It fixed the institution that would become Brown University firmly to one part of the world, to a geographic location that starts small and then gets bigger. Rhode Island and Providence Plantations in New England in America. Reading the description backward is like clicking on the minus sign in Google Maps in order to zoom in on our destination. So click, we are in the Western Hemisphere in the Americas. Click, we are in the northern part of the Americas, specifically New England. We are on Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. One more click and we are here, which is a surprise. I hadn't known this, but in 1764, here meant Warren, Rhode Island, where the college was located until 1770, at which point it moved to Providence. So I hope I've now made my first point. When Brown had its very beginning, its founders thought that it occupied a place in the larger world of the Americas. They thought big, well beyond the admittedly small zone of Rhode Island, the smallest of Great Britain's continental American colonies, which would become the smallest of the United States. We can see this sense of interplay between bigger and smaller worlds at Brown today. I've become an expert, if not connoisseur, of the Brown webpage that goes under the title of Brown and the World. It's here that the university publicizes its current claim to belong to a larger world, so I quote, Brown's global reach extends beyond the gates of campus to establish the university's place as a positive force in a complex and interconnected world. So, the university today is not just a place in a complex and interconnected world, but also a positive global force within it. What I want to do in my remaining time is to explore how this goal has been part of Brown's mission all along, starting in 1764, though not necessarily in ways that would be identical to what being a global entity might imply for us today in 2014. One of the biggest differences was that circa 1764, it was unusual, though not impossible, to think of being global as a positive or even neutral condition. Rather, it had everything to do with power over others. Our current definition of global, circa 2014, has been mostly defined by economists and economic historians. I pay a debt to them by noting this. In the middle to late 20th century, it was those analysts of economic systems who began to conceptualize the 20th century world as global, by which they meant that the world was connected through shared economic activities, even if the profits from those economic activities were not shared equally. Historians have been trying to determine ever since just how far back in time it would be meaningful to talk about a global economy and therefore a global society. Without making any claim that early modern economies were identical to the global networks we see today, it's nevertheless clear that a continuous history of global economic connections goes back at least to the 16th and 17th centuries, meaning that Rhode Island would have been claimed and settled by the English at a time when those long-distance economic connections were matters of fact. By the 16th century, there was global trade in precious substances, as with the Asian spices that made their way to Europe, the African gold that traveled the same way, and the South American silver that under Spanish command would go everywhere from Europe to China. It's obvious that the nations of Western Europe acquired colonies in the New World in order to expand their contributions to these economic circuits and therefore enrich their rulers and their free populations. If Brown was situated within a specific part of the world in New England, that colonial region had always been expected to play a part in the hemispheric and even global economies of the 17th and 18th centuries. Aside from the massive mining and export of silver from Spanish America, the most lucrative New World economies produced agricultural products by using the labor of enslaved Africans. These slaves had been, or their ancestors had been, forcibly removed from their native lands and condemned to a degraded, inherited existence as the property of others. The sugar plantations of the Greater Caribbean had the most voracious demand for African captives and in turn supplied the largest plantation profits. By the 18th century, sugar was one of the most valuable commodities in world trade. For that reason, many other economic activities were connected to these plantation economies, well beyond the zones where sugar actually could grow. Sugar and slavery, sadly, are excellent early evidence of economic globalization. It may have been surprising to the general public that Brown University had deep financial connections to slavery, but probably not to historians. If anything, it would have been surprising had Brown specifically and Rhode Island generally not had any connection to slavery. That lack of a connection would have been miraculous. Almost no economic activity in the early modern Atlantic world did not have ties to the plantation regions, which meant that all regions of the Atlantic were implicated in slavery. To be sure, Rhode Island's colonial economy included many activities. People fished, people farmed, but above all, people in Rhode Island traded. They traded their fish and their farm products for money or for commodities that could not be produced locally, including silver and sugar. And they just traded. Surrounded by the sea, Rhode Island became an entrepot, a maritime center of action for moving goods around the Atlantic Ocean. In Providence and Newport, merchants made considerable fortunes by shipping and transshipping a variety of commodities, including those that originated from sugar-growing areas. That, of course, was how the Brown family made its fortune. In the 18th century, that is, of course, how the Brown family made its fortune in the 18th century. So this is a shipping manifest involving rum that would have been produced from West Indian sugar. And it's a very sad truth that the Brown family, as others in Rhode Island, were no better than anyone else in seeking profits by servicing the slave economies that lay in colonies to the south and especially in the Caribbean. I could give a whole lecture just on this, on the way that to be global during Rhode Island's early history was to be enmeshed in economic circuits that were beginning to draw together geographically distant parts of the world. The result was a world of daily experience of commodities that had originated in faraway places. Just as people did all around the Atlantic, in Providence, people who could afford to do so drank tea from China that was sweetened by sugar from Jamaica. They drank the tea out of porcelain cups that also came from China, poured from teapots or urns made from South American silver, served off tables made from Caribbean mahogany, and very possibly served by people who came from Africa. This is an illustration not based in Rhode Island, but the tea table was made in Newport. As tea became cheaper, more people could afford to drink it, including free blacks, people only just removed from slavery. Tea drinking in Rhode Island was possible and became ever more possible because Rhode Island was, in early modern terms, global. Today's material reminders of global trade may be denser and more varied around us, but they have a genealogy that goes back well before the moment when Brown began to exist. I'll make just one final point about early modern global economies. Today, globalization is often thought of as a voluntary, if not happy, condition. It is thought to offer a fascinating set of vocational and consumer possibilities in our late modern era. This assumption is a legacy of globalization's original definition by economists who defined world-spanning economic formations as mostly positive. A variety of other social scientists, including anthropologists and historians, have been criticizing or complicating that assumption. But despite their efforts, there is still a lingering sense that to be global is to have the ability to swing around the world on a series of tourist visas. Global is glamorous, the stuff of bright, glossy airline advertisements. But in the early modern era, global was not glamorous. If anything, it tended to be the least powerful individuals who were most likely to have global experiences. Historians therefore speak of something called plebeian cosmopolitanism, as represented by this sailor on one of the lowest denominations of British currency, as befit probably the pay scale for sailors, and holding out what seems to be a begging bowl. From working on the history of around the world travel, I know, for example, that the sailors who did this amazing kind of journey in the 1500s, 1600s, and 1700s tended to be men at the very lowest level of society, sailors who lacked other options and whose global experience was more desperate than glamorous. You had to be poor and not have any other options to go eat pineapple and vanilla in exotic parts of the world, a paradox. The awfulness of global experience was even more true for the millions of African captives who made their own long-distance journeys across the Atlantic Ocean. They were uprooted and forced to experience a hemispheric transplantation involuntarily. The Atlantic slave trade was the largest forced migration in human history, most of it accomplished before the age of steam. Early modern globalization, especially in economic terms, was a miserable affair for millions of people, a matter of the stark power that some people had over others. These dynamics of power were also apparent within a political form of globalization that existed alongside and sometimes in relation to the economic form that I've just described. The politics in this case were the politics of empire, which in chronological terms were even more closely tied to Brown's actual founding. That those politics were not far from the founders' minds is evident in their deference to Rhode Island's ruler, the king. The college's charter bears the date of the last Monday in February in the year of our Lord, 1764, as I've already said, but also in the 4th year of the reign of His Most Sacred Majesty, George III, by the grace of God, King of Great Britain, and so forth. That's in a quotation, and so forth. With the so forth meaning Ireland and Great Britain's other colonial dependencies in the Americas. So that founding date of 1764 and the 4th year of the reign of the young George III was a very global one indeed. Only 1 year earlier had there been the formal conclusion to the 7 Years' War, the American phase of which is commonly called the French and Indian War. Indeed, the war had begun in North America with conflict between the French and British and their respective colonial and Native American allies, conflict over the Ohio Valley, the area that lay west of the British colony of Virginia. There, in 1754, a young militia leader named George Washington had failed to repel a French advance force that had established a fort in the area in order to claim the territory for France. The conflict escalated far beyond what had been typical earlier. Over the earlier part of the 18th century, there had been a series of imperial conflicts that I won't get into here. Conflicts mostly between France and Great Britain, plus their allies on the European continent, though these had mostly raged within specific parts of the Americas, plus perhaps parts of Europe. But the 7 Years' War was different. The skirmish in the Ohio Valley blew up into a war that burned its way around the world, eventually resulting in battles on every major ocean and continent. There was significant naval action in both the Atlantic and the Pacific, plus the Indian Ocean. There was military action in Europe, North America, the Greater Caribbean, Africa, and Asia. Historians of the early modern period, some of them at least, now refer to the 7 Years' War as the First World War, preceding by 160 years the next global conflict, the one that began in 1914 during the year of Brown's 150th anniversary. When the 7 Years' War ended it was clear that the peace settlement would have to involve the transfer of an unprecedented amount of territory, as France and Spain, the defeated powers, had to relinquish portions of their New World empires to the victor, Great Britain. The Treaty of Paris, the document I showed you earlier, the Treaty of Paris, signed and sealed in February 1763, accomplished that transfer. Spain gave up Florida. The French gave up all territorial claims to North America. Canada, as the British would call it, was transferred from France to Great Britain, which implied that the entire continent might in future be commanded by Britain. At least the British began to think so. Britain also gained an important foothold in South Asia based on what had been French trading posts in Bengal. These became the seeds of the later British Raj, the massive Indian part of the British Empire during the 19th century. All of this is to say that in 1764, when Brown was founded, politics, global politics, had become nearly synonymous with imperial ambitions. We should not forget these aggressive politics of empire building, which for a great many people at the time expressed the whole point and the whole risk of thinking beyond local boundaries. After the 7 Years' War, to be a member of the British Empire was to belong to what was regarded as the greatest empire since Caesar Augustus ruled over the Roman Empire. Quite a claim. And to be a patriotic member of the British Empire was to celebrate that status quite openly. It was a newly Augustan age. George III was a new Caesar, so here he is, crowned with laurel and with the flowing tresses of a classical god on a gold coin, a contrast to that halfpenny with the sailor on it. This Caesarian or Augustan imaginary was precisely the way that patriotic Britons, including free white colonists, tended to look at their king and their place within the world right after the 7 Years' War. A world map printed in 1764, which is in the case on the table over here, shows a global geography that obviously has grown, even since the big expansions of 2 centuries earlier, as in the map from the 1580s that I showed at the start of my lecture. Here, there are much fuller outlines of the American continents, you'll notice, and the outlines of lands and islands in the Pacific Ocean, which would be the location of the next great scramble for empire. Consider also these images from a series, Scenographic Americana, published in 1768. This was a portfolio, kind of atlas illustrated, that was supposed to educate viewers in the natural grandeur of the sites of war in the Americas, marking places where the British had achieved victory, as here, Guadeloupe, where they both achieved victory and gained territory, as here at Quebec, and where their old colonial settlements were capitalizing on the expanded territory and trade circuits of the now bigger British Empire, as here in Boston, a town slightly to the north of here. But a bigger empire for whom? It was not enough that the 7 Years' War had expanded the British Empire. It also raised unprecedented questions about the rights of colonial persons, free and unfree. The Indian nations that had been in contact with the French and the British had long used the antagonism between those 2 European nations to their own advantage. Now that the French were out of the picture, Indian leaders in the eastern part of North America were very aware that they would need to engage directly with British officials to uphold their rights and sovereignty, as symbolized by this British medal decorated with wampum. The Ottawa leader Pontiac expressed dissatisfaction with this new threat of British power by leading a rebellion against it in 1763. British ministers took note. In a proclamation of that year, 1763, they drew a line down the western edge of their colonial settlements in North America. This border was intended to separate and prevent conflict between the settlers and the Indians, who thoroughly distrusted each other. And to make a long story short, the line did not work. It did not prevent that conflict. Slavery was no less troubling a problem for the newly powerful, newly visible British Empire. Slave rebellions had been persistent reminders that the institution of slavery, however profitable for some, was a security risk. From the 1730s onward, the rebellions had become more ambitious for the slaves and more dangerous for their oppressors. By the 1760s, after the 7 Years' War, criticism of the slave trade was gaining some crucial ground in public life within Great Britain and the colonies. For the first time, there was public debate over the possible rights of black people, as there were for Native Americans. Might at least some of these people be subjects of Great Britain, with at least some of the obligations and rights that this legal status would entail? Even if people of African descent within the British Empire were not automatically the subjects of King George III, was it just to hold any of them in bondage, to exploit them in ways that would have been unlawful for people of European descent? So, Great Britain's ascent to global power put several imperial problems into sharp focus. Most famously, free white colonists began to doubt that the bigger empire benefited them. By 1765, a year after Brown's founding, the Stamp Act would annoy the American colonists sufficiently that there would be a series of protests leading to the eventual repeal of the act. But the trouble did not end there. The British East India Company's monopoly on Asian tea, for example, incited colonial American protests against terms of sale that seemed to favor the eastern, the newer part of the British Empire, against the western part. Within 10 years of the Treaty of Paris, by 1773, colonial dissent would become still keener. Within 12 years, by 1775, the colonists would be declared an open rebellion by George III, whose status as a new Caesar Augustus now looked rather foreboding from the western side of the Atlantic. So the British Empire created by British victory in the 7 Years' War would fall apart. Now, that cannot erase the historical fact that right after the victory, even the American colonists, who had become the fiercest critics of British policy, even they had been staunch British patriots, proud of their place within a global empire, and quite enthusiastic about the military might that had made it possible. For that reason, Brown's founding in 1764 occurred at a high watermark of imperial growth, roughly comparable to a hypothetical situation in which a college or university might have been founded in the United States in the immediate aftermath of World War II. That date marked another moment of American patriotism, yet also a time when the United States' newly enhanced place in the world was questioned, and the nation's sudden global visibility made internationally visible its domestic injustices and inequalities. We continue to live with that legacy in 2014, in which our global status is an ambivalent condition, source of pride, yet also dismay. But there were some peaceful ways to be global in 1764. The economic and political global networks of the 18th century quite obviously relied on violence and exploitation. Alongside them, however, there were social or cultural definitions of human identity that stretched beyond national borders and regional places without reference to war and empire. The idea of being cosmopolitan, for example, had ancient roots. The ancient Greeks had described certain people as cosmopolites, literally world citizens. A person could be a citizen of the world because women at this point were not included in the definition. He did not identify merely with the people in his family, village, town, or nation, but instead with individuals with whom he thought he had greater similarity and sympathy. To describe oneself as a cosmopolite might originally have been intended as criticism for thinking locally, and the term was for that reason not by any means a welcome one because it rejected the bonds of affection and affinity that most people regarded as normal. But a global way of thinking about self and society would seem much more attractive moving forward into the 18th century, at which point the word cosmopolite would blossom into the philosophical stance known as cosmopolitanism. To be cosmopolitan implied an inclusion of oneself in what we might call virtual communities, not the ones expressed through territory, kinship, or political sovereignty, but instead through aspiration to group membership that crossed or transcended these divisions. Religious toleration was a particularly important test of anyone's declaration of cosmopolitanism. In an era when religious differences were still crucial, where distinctions among Protestant groups were bitterly fought, let alone the distinctions between Catholic and Protestant, Christian and Jew, or Christian and Muslim, to insist on universal similarities that might transcend these categories was a radical position. So too were the related debates over whether all humans were more similar to each other than they were different, wherever they happened to live, in whatever form of society. The 18th century was a period of growth and elaboration in the human sciences, forms of inquiry that established early foundations for economics and anthropology. The proposal that all humans were physically, mentally, and culturally similar was probably the most radical form of cosmopolitanism, because it both continued the logic of religious toleration and added to it a set of serious questions about the logic of racism that was otherwise dominant in the world at this time. I don't want to claim that Brown was in the vanguard of any radical form of cosmopolitanism, but I can easily make the point that its founders were serious about upholding a degree of religious toleration. The two governing branches of the original college, two bodies called the Fellowship and the Trustees, were assigned religious quotas, set numbers of Baptists, Quakers, Congregationalists, and Episcopalians. Everyone got that number. That meant that students of all these religious affiliations could enter, though until 1891, only if they were men. The charter also warned that into this liberal and Catholic institution shall never be admitted any religious tests. That's Catholic, I note, with a small c, meaning something spanning beyond the usual categories, but not by any means implying a warm welcome to the actual faithful of the Catholic Church ruled by the Pope in Rome. True, students at the new college could in theory be Roman Catholics, but the same was not true of any of Brown's officers, including its professors and tutors, who were instead required to be of denominations of Protestants. Jews and Muslims, not to mention the animist Aboriginal populations of New England, went entirely unmentioned. Their possible connection to Brown remained undefined, at least for the moment. This was a careful kind of cosmopolitanism. It opened the door, but not too far. And it was, in fact, a culturally and regionally determined tolerance. It did not establish a way to discuss a larger world of religious diversity. It solved a local New England problem of bitter antagonism among Protestants. Still, Brown's terms of inclusion should be compared to policies at other universities of the era. In Catholic parts of Europe and the Americas, colleges were typically open only to Catholics. In England, Oxford and Cambridge admitted only those men who professed themselves faithful to the Church of England. Exclusion on the basis of religious faith, even the exclusion of other Protestants, remained standard policy at Harvard and at the College of William and Mary. So Brown was, for its time, importantly, if carefully, cosmopolitan. Equally important, and especially for a college, was the cosmopolitan concept of the Republic of Letters. This was another virtual community, one that included all individuals who devoted themselves to learning. The idea of the Republic of Letters goes back to the Renaissance, when men of learning claimed a kind of invisible nation for themselves, a republic of citizens whose main task was the development of human knowledge and erudition. During the 18th century, many notable figures referred to themselves as belonging to a Republic of Letters that included men, and by this point, some women, potentially of all literate nations who might share an interest in the pursuit of knowledge. And this is just one image from this great project, the Republic of Letters project at Stanford, which is mapping the correspondence of various Enlightenment figures. So I've shown you Voltaire's circuits of correspondence. They're working on several figures, Benjamin Franklin, and then I think the gossip network of Marie Antoinette, which I await. That would be interesting. But in order to show that wherever these people live locally, and even if they never traveled themselves, their world, their mental world, was definitely international, if not hemispheric, transoceanic. One important indication of the internationalism of the Republic of Letters was apparent in natural science. During the 7 Years' War, and despite the overt hostility between Great Britain and France, officials and even military officers made a point of giving safe passage for scientific information and materials over borders and through war zones, because they assumed that the international work of knowledge would benefit all of humanity and should be a priority despite the temporary troubles. This world of science was present at Brown from the college's beginnings. In 1769, 5 years after its founding, the college laid out its first serious money for the purchase of its own scientific books and equipment, and that's very rapid compared with colleges that had been founded earlier, where there's more of a lapse before there's that kind of serious investment. When the college was moved from Warren to Providence, one argument given for the relocation was that the students would thereby benefit from the scientific books and instruments owned by men of learning in the bigger town. By 1772, Brown was supplied with its own 2 microscopes, a machine for generating an electrostatic charge, and a pair of globes, celestial and terrestrial. The Diary of Solomon Drown, class of 1773, gives ample evidence that students' education included reading and science as well as experience with scientific demonstrations. So, Drown and his fellow classmates performed telescopic observations of the moon, stars, and planets. He did microscopic examinations of tiny phenomena, using a solar microscope to see the digestive peristalsis of a louse. So a solar microscope attaches the microscope to a beam of light so it can project the image here onto a wall, so you can see the digestive peristalsis of a louse, or whatever else you like. Drown also analyzed the force and actions of an electric charge, possibly using a machine like this, which generates an electric charge that you can then store in a battery or simply use freshly generated. Drown used electricity, in this case, to kill an unfortunate pigeon, the lab rat of 18th century Brown. Drown and his classmates also learned that each of their bodies contained enough electricity at all times to set an house on fire. Always good to know. Science was the ultimate way in which Brown's professors and students could demonstrate their affinity with the modern forms of knowledge being taught throughout Europe and the neo-Europes created through colonization. It was an example of intellectual globalization. The students who did these kinds of demonstrations knew that this was the kind of demonstration being done at every other college, everywhere, as well as at learned societies. So it was a kind of participation in what was becoming a global activity. Science was also the means by which the students and faculty at Brown could think of their place in the world in physical terms. In this way, they thought not only of their status as global beings, but they also demonstrated a planetary consciousness. So let me here insert a distinction. Global is social. It implies the social relations that extend over the globe. In contrast, planetary is physical, implying the physical planet itself. In the same way, world can mean the globe, but world tends to get used to describe human worlds, whereas planet and Earth tend, in a contrary fashion, to designate the big mass of matter that revolves around the sun and which we call home. To date, far more historical studies have focused on the social than on the material ways of belonging to a larger world or globe. Globalization has hogged all the attention. That's probably because human-to-human interactions have been most historians' major concern, whether they work on small geographies or large ones. Only recently have human relations with the non-human parts of nature, including the whole planet, only recently have these relations been put into dialogue with human relationships. Only recently have scholars begun to reread historical documents to discover our past sense of our place within the natural world. But it's essential that we do begin to establish what that connection between humanity and nature has been, which is how I'll end my lecture. So far, I've talked about the worlds of Brown circa 1764 as social and global. Now, therefore, I will talk about planetary consciousness as part of that 18th century context in which Providence, Rhode Island actually had a starring role. A sense of planetary consciousness is probably most apparent in this era, 5 years after Brown's founding in 1769. That was the second time in the 18th century that a transit of Venus across the face of the sun would be visible. Such transits occur in pairs about every 243 years. We just had the second of 2 pairs. If you didn't see it, I hope you have a very good doctor. Each of the pairs is 8 years apart. An earlier transit in the 18th century had been visible in 1761. The British astronomer Edmund Halley had known this, and he had postulated in this treatise up to the left that the transits could be used to determine the distance between the Earth and the Sun in what is now called an astronomical unit, AU. By determining the time it took for Venus to cross the face of the Sun, and by doing so through observations at multiple places on Earth, there would be data to calculate by triangulation the distance from the Earth to the Sun. The data harvested from observations of the transit in 1761 were perceived as unsatisfactory, and preparations had begun almost immediately to do better in 1769. This was to be an international scientific effort requiring observers in the parts of the world where the phenomenon would be most clearly visible. Multiple astronomical teams were dispatched to or recruited within places outside Europe where the view of the event was expected to be optimal. The most famous expedition was that commanded by Captain James Cook, who took a scientific team on the HMS Endeavour to Tahiti. That's him demonstrating to the Tahitians the telescope. The observations in Tahiti were done at a place that is still called Point Venus. The transit was visible in many parts of North America as well. The Spanish did observations in Baja California, the British in several of the continental colonies, including Rhode Island. So back home we come. Because Providence, like Rome and like San Francisco, is a city on a set of hills, it offered an excellent vantage point for observations. These were organized by a local and wealthy merchant, Joseph Brown, he of the famous family. Brown bought the telescope that would be necessary for accurate observations, which he imported from England. The provincial government supplied a sextant and 2 clocks, one made locally in Providence, which is quite a compliment to the clockmaker. The effort was led by Benjamin West, a Rhode Island almanac maker and mathematician. A temporary observatory was built on a hill that was about 100 feet east of Benefit Street. And fortunately for all concerned, the day of the event, June 3rd, was clear, and a small crowd gathered to watch the astronomers, though we don't know how many of them stayed for the full 6 hours of the event. What we do know is that after the event, West published an account showing the view from Providence. After the observations as well, Joseph Brown donated to the local college the telescope that had tracked Venus, which is now in the collections of the Hay Library here at Brown. There it is. Other traces of the event have remained even more visible. Transit Street and Planet Street are both named for the observations of 1769. Observation of the transit of Venus was both global and planetary. It was global because it used worldwide social networks to organize the necessary observations. Science and empire were the 2 dominant contexts in which this was done, each offering a circuit of interested actors who could be recruited to engage in the same activities at the same time, even though they were at great distances from each other and in this period of time had no way to communicate with each other during the crucial hours of observation. They each had to trust that the other teams were going to be doing what they had said they were going to be doing. It was the first time in history that a genuinely global activity was done in this way. It may have been the first moment that it would actually have been possible. Observation of the transit was also a planetary event because it described a relationship between humans and the physical globe. Earth, humanity's home planet, was also a vantage point for humans to generate knowledge about their place in the cosmos. The global and planetary context for understanding the founding of Brown University are timely, and especially today. Today is Earth Day. I was so delighted when I found out that today is Earth Day. It's a good day for thinking of our history on Earth and of our status as global citizens. If the world of global human activities is something we can commemorate as part of Brown's history, so too is the history of planetary consciousness. The world of human relations and activities matters, and continual improvement of those human relations to undo the legacies of imperialism, not least, is important. But as we become crucially aware that the inequalities of global society would be worsened by declining natural resources, loss of natural habitats, and climate change, we must keep the planet in mind too. The world of humanity matters, but that world is not enough. Thank you.
thank you, Joyce, for an absolutely fabulous, panoramic, indeed global talk. I must say that, just anecdotally, I have never seen somebody who prepares so impeccably for every presentation that she does as Joyce, and I think it is a real testament to your skill and passion as a historian that you presented what you did today. So thank you very much, and fortunately,